Good morning. Good morning. Hope everybody can hear me well. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this morning, both in person and those who are online. We're excited to be able to come together this morning to discuss what steps countries can take to accelerate and sustain foundational learning. I think we all understand just how urgent this task is. As we heard yesterday from Rob Jenkins, for those of you who were there at the big foundational learning event in the plenary room, in some ways we don't need to convince people about the importance of foundational learning anymore. At the same time, I think we will see from the statistics that, in fact, we do need to convince people about the importance of actually taking action on foundational learning. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Halsey Rogers, lead economist for education from the World Bank. We have an excellent set of panelists today. I'm joined by my colleague Norbert Shadi, who is the chief economist for human development at the World Bank, who will be moderating this session. After I'll give a brief introduction of some of the themes. We've gathered really an excellent panel of both in-person and virtual speakers today. We're first going to hear from two expert speakers who will present virtually, Lant Pritchett and Jonathan Stern, who will introduce shortly. And then we'll have the honor to hear lessons from the experiences from Kenya, Nepal, Ghana, and Guyana. And we have ministers and chief secretary, chief administrators from each of those ministries, whom we'll be introducing soon. And the question we're really trying to understand is what will it take to improve foundational learning quickly, sustainably, and at scale? And so I think just to put a couple of key themes on the table, and those of you who attended the foundational learning event yesterday will have seen these slides, but we want to drive home a couple of points with these two slides. So if we could have the next slide, Eleanor. So I think we all know what we mean by foundational learning. These are really the essential skills in literacy and numeracy that are the building blocks for all subsequent learning and for really lifelong learning. And we really have to have this foundation, just as you have to have a solid foundation for a house. You really can't thrive in school or life without these foundational skills. But what we're learning is that we simply, we don't have strong enough foundations for learning. And one of the probably easiest, most intuitive indicators of this is the learning poverty indicator that was launched by UNESCO Institute for Statistics and the World Bank a couple of years ago. And what that says, that this is about the share of children who cannot read and understand a simple passage by the age of 10. What you see here, when this indicator was first launched, we knew that learning poverty rate globally in all low and middle income countries was 53% in 2015. We've come out with a new report this week jointly with a great set of partners with UNESCO, UNICEF, USAID, FCDO, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And what we find is that even before the pandemic, progress against learning poverty had stalled. We had seen some improvements actually between 2000 and 2015, much too slow, but there was some improvement. It now is stalled. And in fact, so even before the pandemic, we were at 57%. Now, this is obviously a huge concern. A much greater concern is what's happened over the past 2.5 years. According to the latest simulations we've done, that rate is now 70%. 7 in 10 children cannot read and understand a simple age-appropriate passage, essentially by age 10, or even in many cases by the end of primary school. In many cases, it's actually after the age of 10 that these children are actually measured. So this is pretty staggering. And it's quite clear that we need to make a turning point. Now, what the SDGs imply is that this rate should be 0. All children are supposed to be receiving quality education and completing primary school with a quality education. So that's 0. What the countries have announced, and they've submitted benchmarks as part of the SDG monitoring process that imply that this needs to be reduced at least to about 42% by 2030. That's far short of the SDG goal, but it would still require really an unprecedented acceleration of learning, essentially more than tripling the rate of progress that we saw between 2000 and 2015. So the key lesson from this slide is that things have to change. They have to change dramatically. We can't go back. We can't just even recover learning. We can't go back to where we were in 2019 because that's when progress had stalled. So things have to change dramatically. Now, what does that mean? I mean, first of all, we need political commitment. We need political focus on this problem. We need an understanding of how serious it is. We need an understanding that all our other goals that we all share for education, for a rich education that really empowers children and youth for their lives, we have to get this foundational learning. Children have to be able to read. They have to have basic numeracy. So we need that political commitment, not just from top leadership like the ministers we have here, but from all of society. But secondly, the good news is that we now know much better what can achieve rapid progress in reading and in foundational schools in general. And we've summarized that in this joint report as the RAPID framework, 5 main steps, and we'll hear a lot of details about how to reach some of those in the presentation that follow. First, reach every child and retain them in school. So just obviously children have to be in school first. Second, assess learning levels. We can't fix a problem if we can't see it. Too many countries have been flying blind. We need good assessment data, both system-wide for the ministers to look at, but also classroom data so that teachers can respond to the needs of each children and teach them at their levels that they need. Third, prioritize teaching the fundamentals. All the goals in education that we all share are very important, but we won't be able to achieve the other ones unless we get the foundational learning right. So let's start in, particularly in this recovery period, really focusing in on the fundamentals, and then we can build from that. Fourth, increase the efficiency of instruction. We do a lot of things in education that are not the most effective or most cost-effective ways of improving learning. Luckily, we now know much more about what does work for improving learning cost effectively. And we'll hear some from Lant and Jonathan about that, and also from our government examples. And then finally, develop interventions to support psychosocial well-being. We know that this is important in its own right, but it's also crucial for children to be able to learn effectively, that they feel healthy, that they feel safe and secure. And so just to focus in, what we'll be hearing about more today is really this, how to increase the efficiency of learning and prioritize teaching the fundamentals. And so with that introduction, I think I'd like to hand it over to Norbert Shadi, who will moderate the rest of our discussion. And thank you again all for being here.
Thank you, Halsey, and thanks to everybody for being here. As Halsey said, I'm Norbert Shadi. I'm the Chief Economist for Human Development at the World Bank. We will start off with two distinguished speakers, Lant Pritchett and Jonathan Stern. Lant Pritchett is the Research Director of the RISE program at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government, an international research program investigating how education systems can overcome the learning crisis. Lant is also Research Director at Labour Mobility Partnerships, a fellow at the London School of Economics, and he has worked with the World Bank for 19 years, living in Indonesia and India. He's a development economist whose publications span a wide range of development topics: economic growth, state capacity, education, labor mobility, and others. So without further ado, Lant, I pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share the screen and then minimize myself. So this is your chance to see the white guy that's talking. And then I'm stop that. Have I successfully shared my screen?
Yes.
You have, Lant. Yes, go ahead.
Great. So as Norbert just said, I am the research director of RISE, and RISE is a multi-year, multi-country, multidisciplinary research project that has had 7 long-term country teams, thematic teams focused on political economy, and with roughly 400 distinct written outputs and rising. And so I'm summarizing in 10 to maybe 15 minutes an enormous amount of research that we've produced over the last years, and we've tried to synthesize it down to 3 sort of facts and 5 acts that it will take to for systems to make progress. I'm focusing today more on just the 5 acts, given the limited time. I do want to start from partly what Halsey was saying, is that we believe foundational learning is both its own intrinsic goal that's key to well-being and dignity of the child, and in some sense needs no further instrumental motivation beyond that, but it also does instrumentally contribute to many other development goals. I want to be clear that what we mean by foundational learning inside RISE is conceptual and procedural mastery. This is, when we say foundational learning, some people hear a kind of back to basics simple view, but we really mean that children are able to master foundational skills and hence apply them both to more sophisticated concepts and apply them to novel situations in practice. So we just are showing here a sort of contrast between what the systems often produce, which is rote learning, that the length of a pencil is where the tip hits the ruler, versus really understanding that length is a displacement measure and hence able to apply measurement to novel situations. So, and as Halsey just said, we know that the learning profiles, the skill acquisition on any dimension of the desired foundational skills is just too low, and hence children are reaching grades 3 and 4 inadequately equipped with the foundations they need to reach the high goals that we have for them as they emerge. And the foundation is going to be essential to whatever else we want to achieve. So while there are other other goals of the system, secondary, TVET, tertiary, all of those are going to be strengthened and need to be strengthened by having children on a much steeper profile of learning in their early years. Now, worrisomely, the problem that Halsey was mentioning of stalled progress goes back very deep. So not only do we know that the learning crisis is pervasive in countries with low learning systems, it's pervasive across groups, so that it isn't just a problem of disadvantaged children. When you look at the crosstabs, even among the most advantaged groups and low performing education systems, very few of them are reaching even the minimal learning target. So it's really the system we need to focus on, so that learning for all is true learning for all. But a recent study, not by RISE, but by others, shows that if you look over the long scale, using demographic and health surveys to look at the evolution of the likelihood an adult woman could read a single simple sentence, having achieved exactly grade 5 but no higher of learning, that's actually been on a stagnant trend in most regions of the world, on a sharply deteriorating trend over a very long period in South Asia and sub-Saharan African countries. So it is, this learning crisis is not just where we are today, it's we're not even on a path of improvement. So the decline Halsey's talking about in the recent years is actually appears to be the continuation in some countries of a very long-term trend. And this is important because as of yet, many policymakers are not yet prioritizing the learning crisis in foundational skills, in part because they dramatically overestimate what the skills their children actually have. So let me talk about 5 actions to sustain accelerated progress in learning at scale. The first act is commit to foundational learning. We think a major problem with education systems is they're not adequately centered on that core purpose of learning. And unless and until we put that core purpose of learning at the center of all the actors in the education system and the education bureaucracies, the attempt to improve education through programmatic efforts is going to be very difficult. Our country teams came up with very contrasting findings. You know, when we looked in depth at the source of Vietnam's success, it ultimately boiled down to a combination of commitment to learning from both the top down and a messy but continued struggle to achieve that in the locality. So it's not going to be an ideal process that one announces and it implemented smoothly, even in a high-performing country like Vietnam. But it was really the commitment that resonated up and down, both in society and in government, that led to it. Whereas in contrast, a large-scale evaluation of a well-designed school improvement plan of the type that's popular and supported around the world achieved the schooling plans, but literally nothing else happened, because, as the authors concluded, it was embedded in a process compliance culture, not a purpose-driven culture. So they complied with producing a school plan, but they really weren't, there really wasn't this deeper and shared commitment to learning purposes. So Act 2, once one has achieved a commitment, one has to measure learning. And particularly measured learning over time, starting early in school. Our Indonesia country team used retrospective data and combined retrospective and current data to estimate the learning profile. And what they found is, even on simple sort of primary school level numeracy indicators, there was a huge stagnation at a quite low level of understanding. And so early learning just wasn't steep enough to provide the foundations for later learning. And so sort of keeping the additional years of schooling that from almost grade 6 to grade 11, there was almost zero improvement, in part because the early years, although this looks steep, weren't really providing them foundational understanding. And so you need really to start to focus early on, again, as Halsey was saying, on assessment data that provides feedback to the system and to teaching. The third act is what we call aligned systems. Currently, many systems are just radically out of line between the curriculum and the achievable learning and where their students actually are. We see this from India, where the typical 8th grade child in Rajasthan is currently only at a 4th grade curricular level. And so attempting to teach the 8th grade curriculum to students whose current mastery is only at 4th grade just creates an impossible demand on the teachers. And we have recently completed something a couple of researchers called a survey of the enacted curriculum that compares the curricular documents, the actual teaching practices, and what the exams assess. And the height demonstrates the sort of intensity expected of each of those things. And as you can see, both on coverage and particularly on the depth of understanding, the curriculum is expecting radically greater coverage of sophisticated concepts and radically greater depth of understanding than either the examination system or much less what's being achieved by teaching and practice. So bringing those into alignment, where there are a curriculum that reflects achievable teaching and the assessment is aligned with realistic and achievable curricular objectives, is going to be a key to making a system coherent around learning. The fourth act is to support teaching. And the entire emphasis of this, and where we're differentiated this that might sound common sense, is most systems are supporting teachers without necessarily being focused on supporting teaching. And so our Indonesia team, for instance, in a variety of different methods, both qualitative and quantitative, that included sort of tracking early teachers with diary studies over 2 years and included quantitative analysis, found that neither the pre-service nor the in-service professional development was really contributing to the teachers' mastery of practical classroom teaching and learning practices. So there really needs to be a realignment of the support to support quality teaching rather than merely support the existence of teachers. And in order to really bring this, they're going to have to think hard about how one realigns the teacher careers to provide, to attract, retain, and motivate quality teaching. inside the system so that it's clear that the teaching is the focus and teaching is rewarded. The action, and I'm changing slightly from act to action to emphasize the duration of this, is to adaptive approaches to achieve effectiveness in context. No country is going to get it right out of the box. No country has ever sort of achieved perfect implementation of something designed, and that is the result of success. Adaptation is an iterative process, and really kind of the iterative process is what leads to success. And so the system needs to acknowledge that it is not policy design followed by implementation as designed that's going to lead success. It's building in an active adaptation process that allows one to adapt principles, common principles that have been proven effective across countries to the local, social, historical, and political context in a way that makes them effective. So these 5X might sound like common sense, but they're often completely at odds with what current educations do and will in fact require deep changes to achieve and implement. So commitment to foundational learning as a core purpose is often at odds with the way and what is measured, what bureaucracies are measuring, what bureaucracies are rewarded for, what they're the way they're funded for a multiplicity of purposes, including expansion without measuring learning. Measure learning, every system is measured learning, but it's usually measured late at high stakes for the student rather than early with feedback to the system and to teaching. Aligning learning objectives is just many systems keep adding curricular objectives rather than being more realistic about what it will take for them to achieve the foundations. The support effective teaching and learning practices, while every system has pre-service and in-service and all kinds of professional development, they often have not been realistically structured around producing behavioral change and more effective practices. And finally, adopt policies that sustain practice that work in context. Again, there's been a temptation to adopt best practice that's simply on paper and that isn't followed by an adaptive implementation process that brings it into alignment and makes it achieved in context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lant, for that presentation. We'll now turn to a presentation by Jonathan Stern. Jonathan is an expert in research and evaluation within RTI's International Education Division. He has over 15 years of experience in educational measurement and assessment, quantitative methods, research design, and program monitoring and evaluation. Dr. Stern has provided technical expertise and assistance to education programs in more than 20 countries throughout his career, with an explicit focus on training and capacity building for project staff, ministry counterparts, and education stakeholders. Dr. Stern has worked extensively in the education assessment space, for instance, leading efforts in the development and validation of group-administered literacy and mathematics assessments. So, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and glad to be here today. Much like Lant, it's an interesting challenge to try and think about in a 10-minute span how we can advise on countries effectively improving literacy outcomes at scale, especially perhaps at 2:30 in the morning. But I'll definitely do my best to go through this. One of the things that I'll be speaking about today is I'm the principal investigator for the Bill and Melinda Gates funded Learning at Scale study, where we identified 8 of the most highly effective reading implementation programs in low and middle income countries, and spent about 2 years studying them to understand what was driving those impacts, both in terms of the instructional practice and supports, as well as the system supports that were needed for those programs to be effective at scale. And so we'll talk a little bit about some of the findings from there, as well as just some overarching high-level implications for the work and in our sector. So the challenges are now common, I think. Halsey talked about them first. The estimated 70% learning poverty in low and middle income countries is a new estimate. A big part of our challenge and obstacle is then going to be the actual messaging for ministries. I think it's easy to say that there's an estimated learning poverty at a global level. I think what's going to be really important, particularly in the face of COVID and exacerbated learning inequalities, is having more concrete data from individual countries, right? There's a lot of terrific modeling going on right now. Lant and Michelle have been doing some great work, the bank as well. A lot at RTI, we've been doing modeling as well on learning losses, but we have significantly less data on the actual losses that we're seeing in a lot of countries. And there's a surprising amount of variation in the data that we do have. We've been fortunate enough to be able to calculate learning loss in about 5 or 6 different countries where RTI is implementing. And we actually saw a range from some very severe losses to a bit of a stagnation. And in some ways, that stagnation is almost more disconcerting than the losses themselves, because it made us question, what is it about the system and the fact that students are out of school for 2 years that didn't actually cause a major drop in learning? And I think it goes back to some of what Halsey was saying at the beginning about stagnating change from the start, and some of the concerns we have about what these systems weren't even necessarily doing well prior to the pandemic. And then we also, of course, have a situation where resources are finite and we're all working within strained systems, and this idea of making foundational literacy and numeracy learning a priority. And I think I get to skip how to define learning here because Lant did a great job with it, but noting that that really is the focus, right? It's not just about literacy and numeracy instruction, but it's ultimately about the learning that needs to be the priority. The answers themselves are not mysterious. There's a lot of agreement among the literacy policy package that recently came out, as well as the rapid framework that Halsey talked about earlier, RISE's research, which Lant just summarized a lot of, and our Learning at Scale study. There are a lot of commonalities across those. And there's even been commonalities over time. Looking back 10 years ago, I guess, with the rebirth of education, many of the same things that were noted there as the highlights of what we need to do to improve education systems remain intact. But it's more about what it is that we actually need to be doing well, as opposed to coming up with new ideas or reinventing the wheel to do something entirely differently. These 3 bullets are some kind of high-level things that we were happy to see in the first stages of the Learning at Scale study. One of which was that it was possible to substantially improve learning outcomes at scale within government systems. This is not something that we were necessarily overly confident we'd be able to find enough countries and programs that had the required data. And this goes back again to the need for high quality data on educational outcomes, and particularly over time. There are evidence of multiple pathways to success, but commonalities across most of the programs. And as I said, most of our recommendations actually focus on improved implementation of instructional approaches as opposed to new instructional approaches themselves. On the system side, going back to the idea of governments prioritizing foundational literacy numeracy instruction and learning, the priority setting itself in all of the programs that we studied under Learning at Scale noted that the most important thing that they needed to convince governments about both the need for the program itself and the approach that the program was taking was evidence. So data on the gaps in the system, as well as evidence of the successful approach that was being implemented. Government set these priorities, but it's our responsibility to support that as well. A lot of what we saw in these programs, which I think is really important for things like World Bank's Accelerator program to think about, is governments often in the monitoring side of things, we're focusing still a bit more on inputs and outputs, less on outcomes. And although capacity building efforts were a major component of a lot of the work in these successful programs, sustainability still remained elusive. And I think people sometimes forget about the need for continued capacity building at the system level, even though we are more cognizant of continuous professional development at the teacher level. We need to think in a similar manner for how we approach our support for system level actors. In terms of instructional practice, one of the main focuses is going back to basics, right? As I said, it's not doing something brand new again, but it's focusing on the foundational building blocks. Nearly all of the programs that had a large impact at scale included phonics-based instructional approach and used structured pedagogical approaches as well. That allowed the program to be able to focus more additional time on reading and reading instruction, as well as through the use of improved reading materials. And in terms of instructional supports, the biggest thing that was essential here was, once again, the structured support for teachers. Teachers are being asked to implement new instructional approaches. It is a huge ask. We need to remember that students aren't the only ones who have suffered through this pandemic over the past few years, but teachers are dealing with similarly difficult situations. And providing them with structured, positive, collaborative support was really essential for successful programs under Learning at Scale, and something we expect to continue to be needed as systems move forward. And this is all with an eye of making teachers' lives easier. And so with that in mind, I said at the beginning that there's a lot of consensus around kind of how we are framing the issues as well as the solutions across many different organizations. The Gates Advocacy Hub came out with 3 main things that they wanted partners to be able to highlight, that being improving teaching itself, measuring learning, and prioritizing foundational literacy and numeracy. These things I think are quite well aligned with at least 3 of the things that Lant highlighted in the 5 acts. And I think you'll see that even all 5 of those are really covered when we get into this little bit of detail here. So on improving teaching, right, as I said, I think the way I think of it best is making teachers' lives easier. Right, so improved structured materials focused on the fundamentals, including in the literacy space, phonics-based instructional approaches, and comprehensive balanced approach to literacy instruction. Providing continuous positive support from training and coaches. One of the things that we've seen in a lot of systems is a tension between those who are responsible for school instruction transitioning to, or school inspection, transitioning to a supportive, collaborative coaching system. It's something that will take time, but that's really important for teachers to have the support they need. We need to have realistic expectations for teachers and students. This gets back to Lance's point about curricular pace and curricular expectations. And we talk a lot about teaching at the right level, but I think we also need to think very carefully about training at the right level. Right? There are a lot of things that we're asking of teachers, and we need to remember how difficult it is to learn new skills and to implement entirely new approaches in schools. I talk with people a lot about this in our work, that to some degree, I almost feel like we, are taking a semi-professional soccer team and telling them, you need to do everything that Lionel Messi does, and we'll give you a training for 5 days and then go back, and that's how you're supposed to play on your team. And we need to think a little bit more about how can we meet teachers where they are, and have a better understanding of slowing down the approaches to our training, providing significantly more opportunities for practice and modeling, and really understanding where the needs are, instead of coming in with just a gold standard model of training, regardless of the level of teachers. In terms of measuring learning, I think the key is following evidence wherever it may lead. We need high quality data, right? Lant pointed this out, as did Halsey. I think it's important at all levels, right? For system buy-in, we saw that a lot in Learning at Scale, that in order for people to be aware of the issue and understand why we should be going down the road of foundational literacy and numeracy learning as a priority. Where to begin post-COVID. As I said, a lot of systems don't yet know where they're supposed to be starting. And without data on student outcomes coming out of the pandemic, we won't know where the right place to begin is, as well as understanding what works, and then at the teacher level, providing targeted instructional support. And lastly, prioritizing FLN, there's a quote, which I believe is actually from a designer who said, buy less, choose well, make it last. But I think it really applies well to the education space here, right? With a focus on core skills, and thinking about the fact that this is going to require commitments to funding. It's going to require changes in job functions within ministries. It's going to require shifts in the way that monitoring of schools is done, and continued embedded support from donors and other experts while that capacity is being built. And the final piece is that urgency is definitely real, but patience is important here as well. And I think Lant summed this up nicely, but system change takes a lot of time, and one size doesn't fit all, right? We actually have some really good practices that we want to apply, but we need to know that change isn't going to happen overnight, and that in a lot of these places, it will be that iterative, adaptive approach that Lance spoke about that's really going to get us where we need to be. So thank you so much for all your time.
Thank you, Jonathan. We're now going to transition to a hearing from country experiences. Here represented are countries that have invested to improve student outcomes in literacy and numeracy, and we're delighted to have them here. Briefly, we have Dr. Sarah Ruto, who joins us as a representative of the Ministry of Education of Kenya and as an international expert. We have Minister Devendra Paudel, who is the Minister of Education, Science and Technology of Nepal. We have Minister Ya Osei Adutum, who is the Minister of Education of Ghana. And we have Minister Priya Panik Chand, who is the Minister of Education of Guyana. So let me start with Dr. Ruto. Dr. Ruto, what is your view on how countries can effectively improve literacy outcomes quickly and at scale today? We hope you can give us a brief overview of the critical elements of a robust national effort like that undertaken in Kenya to improve literacy outcomes. Thank you.
You spoke very fast. I hardly heard the question. Could you repeat it a bit slowly?
So let me speak more slowly.
Yes, please.
So I guess my question to you is how do you think countries can effectively improve literacy outcomes quickly and at scale today? And we hope you can give us a brief overview, of the critical elements of a robust national effort like that undertaken in Kenya to improve literacy outcomes.
Yeah. Thank you. If I look at what we did in Kenya, there was something that happened before, and then it was met with broad-based educational reforms. Before coming to the educational reforms, we had a coalition of actors who together came up with the evidence that showed we had a problem. So by the time we are, and there was policy alignment, there was, at least we had a policy that stated we need to be ensuring every child is in school and at least reading. And so that gave an opportunity for the various actors inside and outside of government to come together and support in an evidence assembly. And I think that was very important. We had RTI, for example, leading some of that work. We had Uwezo, and even within government, we had processes and a national assessment center. And then, there was that evidence, and I think it gave us an understanding nationally of what we need to do. And this now then led to a decision by government to come up with broad-based educational reforms. And so there were a number of processes, programs that then met with government reforms, led by government and nationwide, not just curricula, but educational reforms. And so I think these are two processes that have allowed us to be a little, to be focused. So that today, when you look at how we think about our education, it is in three layers. We have the early years education and our articulation, understanding of how we will know a child has been successful in early years education is that they should at least be able to read, to be numerate, and to have certain life skills. And so I think that is very important, that it is no longer being seen as a project outside, but the understanding of every teacher in the classroom and every parent is that this is how they will know their child is successful. So foundational literacy and numeracy is ingrained within the system. And our task is now to communicate it. And of course, there are certain challenges. There will be, irrespective of what the national system is doing, there will be that child who perhaps because of geography, perhaps because of their socioeconomic status, perhaps because of gender, perhaps because of disability, are not able to get their right to education. And I think that is where the coalition of actors need to come together to support. The government today in Kenya is putting its money. I mean, we spend 25.6% of the annual budget. Maybe I think it comes to 6.4 of the GDP on education. So if the resources are there, it's also about how do we best use these resources. And these resources are supporting the educational reforms. And these educational reforms are offering a curricula. In the curriculum, I've talked about the focus in terms of the objective. When we are thinking about competency-based assessments, this has also been very alive. And for example, after 1 year of being out because of COVID, when children came back to school, we started with the national assessment run by the Kenya National Examination Council. And the assessment was being done by the teachers. They were the first people to use the evidence that showed the gap between where children were and once they got in school. So ensuring that the systems are strong, national systems are strong, I think is also part of the process of ensuring that we have not just a program that is coming to support, but that the system is alive and is able to support itself. And perhaps that is the way we will ensure sustained growth as we go on. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. By the way, I'm told that the reason we have a humming sound is if people are using their phone near the microphone. So if you have your phone on and you're next to somebody who's speaking, it'd be great if you can turn it off. I have a specific question to follow up with Dr. Ruto. Dr. Ruto, external evaluations find that Kenya's TUSOM program was able to substantially improve reading early grade outcomes in the country. And in fact, it is seen as one of the most successful globally in recent years. So my question is, how has the government of Kenya been able to maintain continuity and ownership of the program, and how have different elements of the TUSOME program been used to inform other programs by the Ministry of Education?
Like I said a bit earlier on, TUSOME came at the onset of major educational reforms in Kenya. And I think that has been very important. So very specifically, for example, while TUSOME was focusing on literacy, we had another program known as PRIDE that was focusing on numeracy. And PRIDE, I think, based a lot of its conceptualization on what TUSOME had been doing. So TUSOME informed other programs that that we had. When we started the educational reforms, a number of the things that were being done by these programs, like TUSOME, like PRIDE, also informed what we have today. And two examples quickly come to my mind. The first is the Cascade training of teachers. We are able, the Teacher Service Commission is able to conduct training because we are having a phased in, phased out reform process where we are phasing in the new system and phasing out the old one. And we are now in grade 6. And the intention has been, because of how expensive it is, that to ensure that before the children are in the next grade, at least all the teachers are in-serviced into the basics of what they need to do. And the Teacher Service Commission borrowed a lot of lessons from how the programs like TUSOME were running the national trainings. And I think that has been very useful in terms of ensuring that a government-led in-service training process proceeds. Another example is on books. Today in Kenya, we no longer talk about books because it's a done deal. Books are in school. Children have 1-to-1 ratio. At worst, a book for every 2 children. And this was, again, a reform process. And TUSOME also supported in that, because I think it was a program that was the first to deliver in this session. Historically, we've had schemes that delivered books, and then that stopped. But TUSOME was able to deliver books to children in school, and we have continued with that. And now it is not something you think about anymore because it is going on very well. But it is important to note that when the educational reforms came in, the ground shifted. So today in Kenya, you'll probably not hear too much of a project being talked about like TUSOME, because it is about the system working to and getting what worked for this particular in these particular programs to work well for the system.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm now going to turn to the Minister, Minister Paudel from Nepal. Minister, what have been the key enablers of success in improving foundational learning outcomes in Nepal, for instance, through the National Early Grade Reading Program? Thank you.
Thank you. The pandemic of the COVID-19 in Nepal has a devastating impact on the Nepal school education. In particularly, the country was just about recovering from the devastating impact of the earthquake of 25th April 2015 that has damaged many schools and classrooms. In Nepal, there are large differences between the area and the social groups in terms of their vulnerabilities and access to alternative education during the pandemic, shortened group has been disproportionately affected, and their learning loss has been far greater than their peers. To make sure we know the extent of the damage that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused in the education sector, we are planning to undertake a comprehensive analysis on the learning loss. Based on this analysis, we will develop a COVID-19 recovery roadmap that will be implemented as part of the initial years of the new school education sector plan. First, I have approved to start in the next month. The recovery roadmap will be guided by the best practice on isolating learning that we have generated in the country through pilot as well as those observed in other countries. The recovery roadmap will be informed by the framework that has been developed by UNESCO, WP, and the UNICEF, which aims to reach all the children, especially those we expect to suffer disproportionately. Assess the children to understand the loss they suffer in their learning and what will be needed to get them back on track. Prioritize their learning recovery through providing isolated education program and the remedial teaching. Focus on the early years, as we know that this is where the learning loss will have the most significant damage on the future learning of the child.
Thank you, Minister. And let me now turn to Minister from Ghana, who I understand is connected remotely. Minister, we know that Ghana has been investing in early grade reading for several years with successful results. More recently, Ghana has stood out for its learning recovery efforts, using radio programs to complement in-person learning and literacy, using targeted instruction in schools, and implementing a learning recovery period upon school reopenings, amongst others. What approaches, Minister, do you think have been working best in Ghana to improve foundational learning in the post-COVID era? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I've heard from colleagues from around the world, and it's insightful when you hear your colleagues talking literally about the same thing that you're also doing. During the COVID era, as you rightly said, we deployed radio programs where internet connectivity was available. We went online. There were TV programs and which we also employ so that we can reach everyone. In places where you couldn't reach them by radio, what we did was that we're able to copy materials and distribute it in the villages so that children can engage in foundational learning. I want to also say this, that in Ghana, what we are focused on is the outcomes. We are embarking on a project that will enable us to know if, in fact, children are attaining the literacy skills that we want them to attain. And consequently, we're doing a national assessment, and as it's being done in Kenya. And what we are doing here is that we are assessing every student in primary 2 and primary 4. Last year we did primary 4 so that we can really look at, align it with what the World Bank called the learning poverty, and begin to look at how our students are doing. Our data is coming out, and we'll be able to assess the effectiveness of programs that has been done, supported by USAID and many other organizations. What we intend to look at is that at the student level, what are the missing links? What is it that the student is not getting? So that the teacher can provide intervention. Then at the classroom level, collectively, what are the concepts that are hard to master by the students? And school level, then we'll go to the district level. We'll look at regional level and begin to see what regions are seeing progress. And preliminary data that we are showing, we're shocked. The kind of regions that we thought may have challenges are not the ones who are having challenges. So this offers an opportunity to begin to dive deep and find what are the best practices in these regions that are doing well, and how do we research it, how do we bring it out, how do we use our data to really analyze. And that's why we are doing a national student information system. We are creating a learning management system. We are giving laptops to every teacher, providing Wi-Fi so that teachers can tap into the assessment bank and look at what they can assess their students and provide the data immediately so that we can see what is going on around the country. The challenge we've had is waiting for too long and then not being able to do anything about the challenge. So we assess students going for primary 2, primary 3 is the intervention year, and we do primary 4. Primary 5 is the intervention year, and then we're assessing primary 6. So by the time they get to primary 6, those who did not do in primary 2 will measure their progress longitudinally, and data is provided to parents, the teacher, the district director of education, the minister of education. We now have a dashboard. We can log into it and begin to see which districts are doing well, which schools are not doing well, how do we celebrate those who are doing well, how do we support those who are not doing. So our major focus now is on outcomes. And how do we know that our schools are doing well? And that is where we are heading. Before COVID-19, learning poverty was there. And I won't say it was exacerbated in Ghana because we're able to do something good during the COVID, but we are not happy. We want every child to be able to read by age 10. And if that is not happening, we have to do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I think the focus on outcomes is something that is particularly important and that we need to keep at the center of much of what we're thinking about. I want to know if Minister Manik Chand from Guyana is here, because we're not sure. Okay, so apparently not. So what we have then is about close to half an hour for questions and answers or comments from others in the room. And if you can just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Please introduce yourself before you make your comment so we know who you are, and we'll just take it from there. Thank you, ma'am.
My name is Nandini Chatterjee Singh. I'm from UNESCO MGIP based in New Delhi, and we focus on social emotional learning in education systems. So 2 points which I just want to bring to the fore, which were also discussed in a session we did yesterday, was the need for foundational learning to now include social emotional learning in addition to literacy and numeracy, something that emerged also a lot during the pandemic. So if there are any thoughts around that. And the second, a point that was briefly referred to even by the minister from Kenya, is to be able to adopt an approach which actually uses probably more screening rather than assessment, so that a tiered implementation approach can be brought in. Rather than assuming that all children need the same thing, a universal screening allows you to put children who need one set of skills or more interventions in reading versus numeracy versus social emotional learning to have better outcomes. And thirdly, if teachers can also be supplemented with social emotional skills in order to provide teacher support.
Thank you. Great points, both on social emotional learning and on screening and being able to individualize teaching to focus on specific skills that individual students are lacking. So thank you very much for that intervention. I know we have another question from over here. I don't know if you can get near a mic so we can make sure we hear you. There are people online, so they won't hear you.
Right, thanks. So I'm Barbara Trudell with SIL International. And I wanted to bring into the room the issue of language of instruction choices in effective child learning. My team and I do a lot of early grade reading assessment work in African nations and analysis of EGRA results. And we find that at some points, you cannot tell whether a child is unable to read because the child has not got reading skills, or because they do not speak the language in which they're being tested and in which they're being taught. This is definitely a problem. Now, language in education policy in some countries is really helping, and in some countries it's really hurting. But the attention rather to 1 to 2 languages in such multilingual, rich, linguistically diverse nations really isn't adequate. You still aren't reaching tens of millions of children, and I'm only talking about African nations. So I think we're still not reaching lots and lots of children, and language of instruction is a very big reason why. And there's lots of ways to address this. And I know in this company, many of you have done that, but ignoring it does not make it go away. And I just wanted to put that out here in this group that is doing such excellent testing and excellent thinking about foundational literacy and numeracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a critical issue, language of instruction. Thank you for bringing that up. I know we have 2 interventions from over there. First, lady to the right, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Gemma Wilson-Clark. I'm the Chief of Education at UNICEF Jordan. And the presentations by Lance and Jonathan really spoke to the experience of Jordan post-COVID. And I just wanted to highlight the data that we now have available in Jordan to measure learning. The government, with UNICEF support, has carried out a national diagnostic assessment for all students from grade 4 to 11. Over 80% of students have now had their marks entered on a portal linked to the national open EMIS system. And the results have been available to teachers first. So every teacher has a dashboard which shows individual children's results. The assessment takes the children 2 grade levels back, very short assessments. The national directorate and school level reports are now ready, and these are going to have to be sensitively handled. We're not ready to share those results. The data belongs to government, but I think it does speak to the lack of alignment between the curriculum and achievable learning objectives. We're also working on an accelerated learning program, which provides scripted lessons for teachers, for those teachers that want to support children to catch up. You can't just take away the textbook and ask them to teach 2 grade levels behind. So this provides an opportunity over time to really have some accelerated learning in Arabic and maths. And I was very interested to hear about the experience of Kenya on their reading program, because we're also implementing a structured catch-up program for reading in the refugee camps, and have found that the majority of children in grade 6 are unable to read to a grade 3 level. And so certainly they're not able to access the curriculum. So I think the situation is, it's not a good picture, but I think it's extremely exciting what's been achieved. And I think it's a very strong foundation for the government of Jordan to continue to take action and really support children to catch up post-COVID. We'll be happy to share our experience with anyone individually after this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. I think I'd like to stress, even though Jonathan said that there's a lot of heterogeneity in what COVID has done to learning outcomes, on average, we're finding there's a major World Bank report, which we're finalizing on this, that for every month of school closure, there was on average a month of foregone learning. So in countries that had schools closed for, say, 12 months or 18 months, as many did, the average child lost 12 or 18 months of learning. And that's the underlying average, which means that some kids, as we know, those with more educated parents, those who had better access to some form of online instruction, actually did learn something during the pandemic. And if the average is 0 learning, that means that other kids, if some did learn something, that means that other kids actually not only learned nothing, but forgot some of what they already knew. And these are now real data, not just based on simulations. So I think the situation is extremely dire, especially in those countries in which schools were closed for a very long time. And we're beginning to see this, as I say, in both lower middle income and upper middle income countries that have done rigorous testing using comparable tests for children of the same age before the pandemic, and then now when schools have reopened and kids have returned to schools. And this is, we also find that the largest learning losses are amongst the youngest children, which is particularly worrying given what we're all concerned about here, which is the ages at which foundational learning, foundational numeracy and literacy skills should be acquired. So all of this evidence on what has happened during the pandemic comes on top of what Halsey was showing before and what Lant was referring to, which was we were already on a not good trend. We were already either stagnating as countries or actually going down in terms of the proportion of kids who achieve foundational skills. So I just want to reiterate what, once again, really there is no need to reinvent the wheel, but there is a tremendous amount of urgency in trying to figure out how best to address this situation in countries, both from upper middle income country all the way to lower income countries. Ma'am, I know you were next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Susan Place Everhart with Sabre Education. Thank you all for your contributions. I just want to focus very specifically on early childhood education and particularly play-based learning, which has shown a lot of evidence of really being able to capture children at that very young age and their imagination for learning. We work very closely in Ghana on teacher training for what Ghana does have, which fabulously is a 2 years of kindergarten play-based learning curriculum that's been adopted. And now the challenge is to ensure that all teachers are trained to deliver that. I would love to hear others who have been able to successfully approach early childhood education as a real key in what many have said today. For example, if children are to achieve certain standards by primary 2 or 3 or 4, it must start at those early years. So just wanting to highlight that and look forward to hearing from others.
Thank you very much. For sure, early childhood education is critical in making sure that the kids who enter school, formal schooling, are ready to learn. And thank you very much for reiterating that. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, everybody. Karen Mundy from the International Institute for Educational Planning. I wondered whether the panelists, especially Jonathan, might speak more to the system capacity point that he made at the very end of his presentation. I think one thing we know at IIP, we support governments to strengthen their planning and their ability to plan forward and to have good capacity in the central ministry. But increasingly, governments come to us and say, how can we strengthen downstream capacity for implementation around alignment for learning? And perhaps one of the dimensions we often forget is this middle tier, the middle tier who has to make decisions using an adapt and iterate approach, as Lance said. So I'd be very much interested to hear from panelists, from the governments, about really how you're tackling that implementation challenge through capacity development at that middle tier. Thanks.
Thank you. I think we're going to hold off on having Lant and Jonathan speak, because I know we have some other people in the room who still want to share their thoughts with us. And if we have a minute or two at the end, we'll pass the word over to them. But we only have about 20 minutes left. So, ma'am, it's over to you. Thank you.
Sure, thanks very much. I'm Amara Martinez. I'm also working at UNESCO MGIP in Delhi, but previously worked with the South African government for quite a number of years in the public policy space. So my question is just building on the previous speaker about ECD, and particularly directed to Kenya and a couple of the other speakers, just to find out how ECD actually fits into the foundational phase. Has there been any sort of screening in terms of learner readiness by grade 1, and how that actually feeds into what teachers actually need to teach? And then the second thing is about literacy and numeracy. So a lot of what we saw in my previous role was about learning losses being suffered more greatly in the mathematics space than in reading. So it's also just about figuring out how do you actually look at teaching and learning practices for teachers to be able to take that on. And then also just thinking about, is it about learning losses, or is catch up even realistic? You know, I think it's about, if we've lost so much, is it realistic to actually think about it in that way? And what do we need to do to kind of look forward to say, this is where we're at right now. It might not be exactly where we want to be, but how do we take it forward in terms of equipping teachers to have the right tools to take it forward? Thanks.
Thanks for that intervention. And again, reiterating the importance of early childhood education as a sort of foundation for children before they enter school. In general, what we found is, in fact, that learning losses have been larger in math than in language, which perhaps is not all that surprising, given that there's some exposure, obviously, to language, even when you're not in school. So children in general have lost less in terms of language than in terms of math, though they've lost in general in both. The learning losses have been even more severe in math than in language in general. Thank you. Quick question I would like to put to the expert as well. When we had global exchange of information during COVID and after COVID, and what we learned was that a lot of countries under a lot of pressure, access, shortage of teachers, shortage of spaces, ended up prioritizing exam years when the schools reopen, or when the schools try to gradually reopen. That's a kind of reality, because of the shortage of teachers, etc. What kind of message or the suggestion or advice experts can give us so that the system can get some lessons? Thank you. Thank you very much. Sir, yes, and then you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Michael Wache Yadom. I'm at the Institute for Educational Planning and Administration in Ghana, and also the national convener of TES for Ghana. Comment and a question. Comment, it appears that many of the initiatives to promote foundational learning that were shared, we know that for some of them, funding is external. Now, particularly from our colleagues from African countries, if you could share specifically strategies that you have in place to ensure sustainability of these initiatives, especially in the area of funding, so that when the external funding source expires, the initiatives also do not die out. So if there's any specific example, I would love to hear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, you're next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Icha Khadija, a member team for transformational education in Indonesia. And I would like to share key points that we are doing at the moment. First of all, Indonesia changed the high-stake testing into a national assessment, which focus on literacy and numeracy and character development in schools and learning environment. So this is more thorough, and this has been starting this year, or last year. And then number two, developing curriculum which give flexibility to schools to contextualize according to where they are, because Indonesia is very diverse geographically. But it's not mandatory. So it depends on the situation of the school. And schools can adopt the new curriculum when they are ready. And then during the pandemic, the government allow emergency curriculum that schools develop to adapt their need. And then last but not least, which is also important, is transforming the teacher preparation, teacher distribution, and professional development, which focus on differentiated learning and socio-emotional learning and coaching and mentoring. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take these last two questions. I want to make sure we get a chance for the panelists to share any thoughts they have in response to the comments and the questions that have come up. So I just urge you both to be brief, and then I'm going to turn over to our panelists originally. Yes, sir.
Hi, everyone. Bill Godelli from the Global Deans Network of Education Deans, also from Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. My question is, the gap between where we are now and where we need to be is so severe that I think at this point it's probably wishful thinking to think we could get there. So I then turn to the question of what are the technological innovations that are in the offing, particularly around AI and algorithmic learning, that could be used to supplement the work that's being done by teachers. So I think about the load of a mass profession to handle this task is probably far beyond its capacity, as evident, prior to the pandemic, certainly after. So I wonder if panelists have thoughts about what's in the offing in the next 5 years in that remote domain.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Tapilaks from Vinchurch Aid. I want to thank the speakers about raising the teachers' well-being and teachers' support. I would like to ask that how can we put that even more on the agenda? I think we have during the COVID bumped quite a lot on the situation where, for example, donors did not want to pay the salaries of the teachers during the school closures, which meant that we have lost quite a few teachers from our programs now that the schools are opening. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to pass the word to Lant first, and Jonathan. Lant and Jonathan, I urge you both to, if you have any thoughts in less than 2 minutes that you want to share in response to some of the comments. Obviously, you can't address all of them. That would be great. So let me start with Lant.
I think there was very rich discussion, and I think the one thing that I think is key to a lot of this that was mentioned both by Jonathan and was raised directly by Karen Mundy is this middle tier between the sort of top-down policies at the ministry level and the classroom, and how you take the existing middle tiers of the system, which have very much been in kind of supervision or inspectorate mode, and change the mindset to support teachers in teaching practices. I think that is, if I had to name the single most challenging implementation issue, it's that, because often these middle tiers have for so long been so distracted to so many different things that reorienting them into being a truly supportive part of a purpose-driven learning system is a huge implementation challenge. But when it's done right, it's a force multiplier. It can, there's a lot of people in the system that can be doing radically more effective things, but it really is the hardest behavioral shift to go from relatively passive transmission of messaging or relatively, almost hostile inspectorate mode into supportive and teaching mode and focused around learning and supporting teaching. So I think that is the issue that I think it's the hardest issue, and yet it could be the highest return because you have these enormous assets that are essentially locked into an unproductive mode of utilization. So that's the one thing I would highlight that I think came up.
Thank you, Lant. I know it's the middle of the night for you, so thank you for sharing your thoughts. Jonathan, you have a couple of minutes as well.
Sure, thank you. I actually was going to tag on to the same point that Lant just raised, so I don't have to spend much time on that one. Although I should note that as a next phase to this learning at scale activity, one of the things we're actually doing is identifying a few successful entirely government-led programs that have been effective at scale, as opposed to the first phase, which was all implementer-led programs working with and through ministries. And I think that might help us unpack a bit about that middle tier and how they may have been assigned or had different functions than in the system prior. And Karen, I'll actually be sending you an email about that specifically. So look out in your inbox for that. And the other last thing I just wanted to mention briefly while I had the floor was about the heterogeneity in learning loss. I apologize if my comment made it sound as though I don't think that we have a very severe issue with losses and that we don't have evidence of those losses being real. I was only pointing to the fact that in some situations where we are not seeing as much, or some students who aren't learning aren't losing as much, that it provides us with some additional evidence about this dire need to improve the teaching and learning that already wasn't occurring in some places. And now we have an opportunity to address it, but that overall, there's no doubt that this time out of school has had a major impact on lost learning for children, as well as several people in the room have said today, on the psychosocial well-being and the social emotional learning skills of children as well. So just wanted to make sure I had a moment to clarify that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm now going to pass the word in the same order as we started. So Dr. Ruto, any thoughts that you might have that you want to share now as we're wrapping up the session?
Since some questions were asked, perhaps respond in the 2 minutes you've given me. The first on language, I agree. In Kenya, we are finally making some progress. And this is with educational reform, we're able to give space in the timetable for indigenous languages. Now in our teacher training programs, for the first time, teachers are training in indigenous languages, and we are very excited about that. So in 3 years, if this conversation happens in this space, we might have something more to report. The other question that was also directed was on early years education in Kenya. During the reform, what we did was to unite the pre-primary sections with grades 1, 2, and 3. So we have one design that looks at them as a whole, because we wanted continuity. And I think that has really helped. So you don't have to think about different tests. It's one design, maybe different teachers, different spaces, but one design, similar objectives. And I think that is going to help continuity, because we have very low numbers in our early years. And we need to improve that as children begin to learn certain pre-numeracy, pre-literacy skills that they then continue on in the early years. I don't think you can talk about foundational skills up to grade 3 without looking at that focus. So thank you for the people who have brought up early years education and everything that comes with it, bringing play, excitement to excite learning, make children happy as they're reading, I think are very important concepts as we are talking about. And then maybe because you're looking at me like I need to stop is the funding. And I think it is important that as governments, we have to put our money where we feel it's important. And all of us agree that education is a right for the children. And I think it is important for us to look at any support that comes as something that is augmenting, complementing, but it cannot be the real deal. Because then when they leave, what happens? That is criminal, I think, if you leave children without an education. And so one of the things that has been very important for Kenya is asking governments who need it to at least put 20% of their budgets, and we are doing it at least up to 25%, so that if we have support from a funded project, like at the moment, Bill Gates is coming in, I think, to support with teachers, then it is supporting, complementing, using that to feed into the system. But governments, we must own education, and then the rest of the village of the world comes to support what you own. And that way, perhaps we might be able to reach these ambitious goals that we have set for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister, the floor is yours for any final thoughts that you have for this session.
Nepal has been constant on internet connection and electricity. This means that online learning resources developed to continue learning during the pandemic can only reach a selective group of students. This also means that the gaps between these students and other children in area where alternative learning resources could not reach has increased. We work together and mobilize local government, civil society, and other stakeholders. We work with the education cluster to provide priority response to continue learning in the most remote area through learning back and the mobilized teacher, for example. We pilot accelerated learning program and catch-up programs and scale them up when they were successful. We also developed safe learning books that include guidance for the parents so that children could continue to learn in the other grades and get guide from the parents and sibling. Teachers were mobilized to continue teaching children in the early grade in the small group within their community in the open air to minimize this risk transition. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And the Minister from Ghana, I don't know if you're still online and have some thoughts you want to close with.
Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity. I think we've heard a lot, we've learned a lot. In Ghana, we are focusing on making sure that no village will be left behind. So we've started what we call the 90-90-90 plan, ensuring that 90% of all students in those targeted communities will attain proficiency in foundational learning skills by age 10, and 90% will move on to senior high school, which is now free in the country, whether day or boarding. And then 90% will move on to some kind of training, apprenticeship, or tertiary. So in communities that we are targeting this, which is now being supported by the Big Win philanthropy, we are looking at how do we turn around the fortunes of our children, our communities, and ensuring that if something is not going on right, the chief, the assembly member, the local people know, and it's transparent to everyone. And leveraging on the power of technology, the Ministry of Education also know whether things are working or not working. We want to focus on outcomes. We are tired of process. We've done processes for too long, and we want to see the outcomes and do intervention to ensure that we get to that destination. One critical thing that we are confronting is the issue of language of instruction. We've talked about native languages and other languages, but we also believe that our children can master the English language, but they need to be taught as students whose second language is English. I remember early on in this presentation, somebody alerted the speaker that he was going too fast. There's something called sheltered instruction that we use when I was teaching in Los Angeles, where you have to enunciate clearly and do it in such a way that somebody whose native tongue is not English will be able to understand. Invariably in Ghana, we've taken it for granted that we are second language speakers, and we want to teach English as if we are teaching it to Americans. And we have to begin to understand that there are different approaches and strategies for mastering the language as a non-native. And those strategies we are now begin training of teachers for them to master, so that they can in turn help our students to master. If the language of instruction is not mastered, how do we get access to the content that is buried in our books and get the children to master what we are teaching them? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Minister. So a couple of closing thoughts from my end. One is there's been a little bit of a discussion on the importance of funding, and I think that's absolutely a critical discussion, and the fact that the bulk of funding for making up these losses and in general for improving foundational skills at the end of the day comes from domestic resources. And so to think through about how to mobilize those domestic resources and assign them to education interventions is a critical thing, and how to assign those resources towards clear objectives. And that's a second thought that I have on this, which is the importance of measurement. It's hard to know if we're making progress if we're not measuring outcomes, and the importance of measuring progress towards outcomes, not simply inputs or outputs. We've seen the dramatic figures that Halsey showed earlier about how, in fact, we see a deterioration in learning outcomes even prior to the pandemic. There's no way we're going to know if we're actually reverting that unless we are measuring things. And the third thought that I had is the importance of identifying programs that work, but at scale. There's often programs that seem to be very successful on a small scale, on a pilot basis, funded by this or that donor or in some way. But really, we need to figure out what can actually work at scale and the importance of identifying and implementing those programs. So that's all from me. I think Halsey has a couple of words he wants to share, but from my end, thank you very much for a very rich discussion. I tried my best to slow down my speaking pace.
It's hard for you.
Towards the end. It's hard for me, especially if I'm trying to keep time as well. But thank you very much for this discussion.
Great. Thank you, Norbert. I just want to take us back a bit to the beginning. I mean, we heard from Lant that we have this rhetoric supporting foundational learning, but that the results globally are not really showing that. It's not showing that we're prioritizing foundational learning, because we know what can make a difference. And we heard that from Lant with his 5 acts. We heard from Jonathan about the lessons about learning at scale. What we need is a system level prioritization. We need more concrete data on actual learning losses, on the state of learning. We need better techniques for teaching and learning. We've heard that we now have a lot of evidence on what those are. Obviously have to be contextualized, but there's a lot we can learn globally. And we have to support teachers with the goal of improving teaching in order to implement all this. So, I mean, really the bottom line though, is that we can't return to business as usual. That won't recover learning, and it certainly won't make a dent in the crisis we saw before COVID. And we're very grateful for the countries who are showing us how to move forward. I mean, Kenya, which to so many broad-based reform based on best-in-class literacy programs. You have Nepal with focused attention on those who are most harmed, using best practice on accelerating learning. In Ghana, we have the focus on outcomes, assessing effectiveness, figuring out what students aren't getting. These are all great examples, using technology intelligently with the goal in mind, and not just for the sake of using technology. So we have the evidence, we have the examples. What we really need is to take those, move forward, help other countries move forward. I think I remember Lant 10 years ago at the World Bank, when he was helping us launch our learning strategy, he called for kind of a social movement for learning. And that's what we need. We really need everybody to understand the importance of prioritizing this, and then using the evidence that we now have to move forward. And really excited to be with all of you here. It's very clear that you're all part of this, and really let's take that forward. Thank you all very much, and special thanks to all the speakers.